Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the International Section's presentation on Brazil's new privacy law. We really appreciate you joining us today. We appreciate the International Section for sponsoring this event and for also the Privacy and Penalties section of the Georgia Bar putting out the word and sending out more invitations. Very happy to have you here today. We think should be hopefully a very helpful discussion of Brazil's new privacy law. So with that, I want to introduce some really great panelists. We will have time at the end, hopefully, for questions. To the extent you have questions as we go along, make sure put those in the chat function of the Zoom, and we will try to address those as we go along or at the end. I want to introduce our really great panelists and speakers here. First, we have Bernadette Diaz from CGM Avocados. She's a partner in Brazil. And Bernadette, you want to introduce yourself and just give a little bit about your practice?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm very honored to have those discussions with all of you. Well, I'm a Brazilian lawyer who has lived in the United States for a while, and we do mostly business law, corporate law in Brazil. So we assist a lot of international companies doing business in Brazil. And we started working with data protection since companies started adapting to GDPR. So a lot of companies, like European companies doing business in Brazil or Brazilian companies doing business in Europe, started seeking help for that purpose. So we see this is a fascinating world. We believe we have a lot of challenges implementing this law in Brazil, but we're finally excited to have more guidance on how to protect data privacy. Data and privacy of Brazilians. So I hope to share some of this experience with you today. Thank you, Amanda.
Great, thank you, Bernadette. We also have Bruce Darkesian, who's a privacy counsel at the Coca-Cola company. Bruce, if you want to introduce a bit about yourself and how you, what your role with Coca-Cola in terms of the Brazil's new privacy law is, that would be great.
Sure, just briefly. So I am one of 5 privacy counsel at Coca-Cola, and we've sort of divided up the world, and Latin America is my part of the world. So I do cover Brazil, and I've worked at the company since March of 2019. So I came in just in time to start help implementing the LGPD at Coca-Cola.
Great, thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Bernadette. So first, I think it would be really interesting to hear from the audience as to where you are in terms of your preparation for Brazil's new privacy law. So we have posted a poll. If you could go ahead and answer, we've got a few questions here. We've got like 6 questions, and really like to, if you can put your response in and submit it. We will address those as we go through the presentation. So it'd be great to hear from you and know where you all are in your preparations. Bernadette, I guess to talk initially about where things stand. We've had a little bit of a roller coaster ride, especially trying to keep up with, is the law effective? When's the law effective? Could you just tell us generally, like, what is the general mood in Brazil right now about this law? Are your clients panicked? Are they calling up frantically? Are they yelling at you? Or what's the general mood? I know with GDPR things got a little bit hectic and stressful, so I'm just curious to know what it's like in Brazil right now.
Yeah, well, these are scary moments for various reasons, and not only LGBT, but it just adds more ties right to the whole situation we're living. People were actually counting on the delay of the effective date of the law. So we honestly, we really think the times we're expecting there, and with the pandemic and the shortage in budgets and everything, so a lot of companies postponed their investments that they needed to make in order to comply with the law, and they were caught by surprise by the fact that the law is now effective. So, well, some companies, mostly IT companies and companies that were already GDPR compliant, they anticipated their efforts to comply with LGPD. But I would say that many other companies were caught by surprise and right now just running to get things ready and get prepared. So we're kind of, in some cases, just helping them, change the tire while the car is moving. And the action plan to implement the law had to change to consider this new situation.
That's great. Do you want to share your screen and the slides?
Sure. Well, we prepared some slides. I don't want to get into details of the law. I think it would be, I would assume that some of you are familiar with most of the concepts, but the idea here is just to give you a high-level view on what LGPD is and what kind of innovations it brought, and also, where we stand and what to expect from the future. So as Amanda said, please feel free to, jump in with questions, send them in the chat, so we'll try to address all of them. So explaining a little bit what we were talking about, the chaos of the effective date of the law, but although it's a bill passed in 2018, there was an executive decree earlier this year postponing the effective date from August this year to August 2021 and also May 2021 for some parts of the law. But unfortunately, this executive decree was not entirely converted into a law, meaning that right now, all the material provisions of the law are effective as of September this year, except for the administrative penalties that will only be effective in August next year. And what does that mean? Like, although the companies will not be subject to fines for not complying with the law, since the obligations with respect to data processing and also the rights of the data subjects are already enforced, well, companies may be subject for litigation in court for breach of those provisions. So that brings the need to adapt to the law as soon as possible.
That's great. Yeah, it's interesting with our polling question too. We've got about 56% of organizations that have not started preparing yet, and 45% of our audience has started to prepare. Interestingly, 85% of the people attending today did prepare for GDPR. So we did have a good bulk of organizations that did prepare for GDPR. And I think that's hopefully will be a good foundation as they prepare for the Brazilian law, which is very similar. Bruce, like when did Coca-Cola start preparing for LGPD?
Well, as I mentioned before, I started at the company in March of 2019, and the team shared with me sort of what they had already done, which was education about LGPD at a high level, among the business unit there, sort of the requirements of the law at a high level. And then not really much happened till about the summer last year. And then we started thinking about, okay, what is our project plan? What does our implementation need to look like? And even then, it moved pretty slowly until about December of last year, when I and a colleague went to our office in Rio, and we were able to get the support of the business unit president, which was really important. He brought together his functional leads from various areas such as marketing and HR and other functions, and he deputized them and said, look, you are responsible for getting privacy in place in your area. So that's, I would say December is when we kicked off in earnest. And then in March of this year, about 2 weeks before the pandemic, started to shut down everything, we hired a project manager to manage the Brazil privacy project. And thank God for that, because I think if she had not been on board by then, I'm not sure she would have been able to do as much as she'd done, and people might have just started ignoring things. So we were very lucky with the timing, and we were able to get it done, by the deadline.
That's great. Really great to hear. Cool. So Bernadette, so what organizations need to worry about this law? What does it apply to?
Yeah, well, first, it's not that we didn't have anything on data protection in Brazil. We did have general principles like the Constitution, the Civil Code, the Consumer Code, but those laws, they just brought general principles that, the enforcement of them, and also brought a lot of insecurity for the companies because we weren't sure, what kind of immediate and express actions were required by companies in order to comply with those principles. LGPD brought more clarity on those issues. For example, it made clear to who the law applies, right? So it's clear that the law applies to any data processed or collected in Brazil, or data that concerns Brazilian individuals, or even data processing made with the purpose of offering goods or services to Brazilians. Meaning that even if you are not a company established in Brazil, if you're doing any of that, you're subject to the law. Another thing that the law brought, it's based on certain cornerstones. It brought grounds for data protection processing. It established expressly what kind of rights the data subject had. It also determines the creation of a national authority to enforce, inspect, and also assist in the interpretation of the law, and also established some duties and accountability for those who did not comply with the law. So it changed some paradigm, especially in a context where, different from the Europeans, Brazilians didn't exactly used to think a lot about their data and what was done with their data. So it's really a change in behavior, not only in companies, but also in individuals in Brazil.
So I want to go back to our poll question real quick. We asked the audience if they had updated their privacy policy yet, and so far the majority of our audience has, so 58% have not updated the privacy policy for Brazil yet, but 42% have. So that's a pretty good amount of updates in terms of doing that. What would you say? What are some of the other grounds besides, if, for example, I imagine similar to GDPR, you have the privacy policy serving as transparency and notice to the data subjects. What else would you say? What are some of the other grounds for processing?
Can you hear me now, guys? I was trying to.
Oh, that's much better. Yes,
okay.
Better.
I was changing the speakers to make sure you could hear me better.
Okay, I think that'll make the audience much happier. Okay. Yeah. So besides consent, what other how similar to GDPR is it? Like, what are some of the other grounds for data processing?
Sure. Well, other grounds. Let me just make sure that you're getting the right screen here. Sorry.
Interesting seeing the Portuguese version of PowerPoint too.
Right. Basically what the law says is in order to process data in Brazil, of course, one of the most common grounds is getting consent of the data subject. But the point with the consent is in Brazil, at least based on our law, it can be withdrawn at any time and for no reason. So it's not exactly the best grounds for data processing, although it is valid and used many times. So basically what we tell companies is that to the extent possible, if they could get other grounds for data processing, they would be in a better position for that. And the law does establish certain grounds that can be used, such as legitimate interest, processing data for purposes of complying with regulatory requirements or compliance with contractual obligations or processing data based on, in order to protect credit. So these are other grounds that can be used by companies to process Brazilian data subjects. There are, though, some specific requirements for sensitive data. So if you intend to process sensitive data of Brazilians, there's a higher level of protection for that. So despite the fact that, for example, we can use performance of contract and legitimate interest as grounds to process data generally, those grounds cannot be used for sensitive data. And also, depending on the sensitive data, the sharing of the data with respect to health of individuals is subject to an even higher level of protection. So, for example, the law does say that if we're dealing with health data, there are only specific cases where you can share this information. And you cannot even get the consent of the person to get a sharing of information for economic purpose. Of course, there's a lot of interpretation that has to be given to that. And we expect that the agency helps in this point, because we do not know yet the extent that the authority will give to the interpretation of economic purpose, right? So the law basically say that you cannot share sensitive health data of individuals, not even with consent, if it is for economic purposes. So the meaning of economic purpose is yet to be defined by the authority. This is one of the points where we still need guidance to apply. So for now, when companies want to do that, we're giving them the red light or the yellow light that you may try to give your own interpretation right now, but be aware that within 6 or 12 months from now, you may not be allowed to act as you're doing, depending on the interpretation that is given to this specific article of the law. Another grounds that is defined by LGPD relates to international data transfer. And for companies operating internationally, this gains higher ground, right? Hosting data in Brazil is a very expensive activity. I think there's not a lot of data centers available to host this data. So it's very common, especially for international companies, to collect data in Brazil and then transfer that to another country. On that, the law does bring some provision on this. It allows the international data transfer under certain circumstances, but we're still waiting for the authority to get even more clarity on that. So basically today, if you get the data subject's consent, you may transfer the data to another country. But other than when you get the consent, which, as I said before, consent can be withdrawn at any time, other bases that you would have to that would be, for instance, if you are transferring data to a country with an appropriate level of protection, or if you are transferring it to a country that is authorized by the national authority. As we don't have the national authority yet, right now, we would basically tell our clients that they need to base this transfer on the consent of the data subjects until we have more details on how it will go moving forward.
So there's we don't know yet. I mean, we would assume probably EU would be one of those adequate countries, but it's hard to say that how the US is going to be treated, right? So we don't know.
Yeah, what we hear in Brazil, based on discussions that have been going on with respect to that concept, is that most people don't think the United States as a whole would be considered a country with an appropriate level of protection, although California may be. But the thing is, it really depends on how the agency will be structured. And there is a general feeling in Brazil that there will be a lot of political influence in the agency as it is supposed to be structured right now. And this political structure, and considering that Brazil has been trying to get in good terms with the United States, may cause you to be considered a country with an adequate level of protection, at least right now with this government.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. We can't forget the politics. That's a very good
Yeah.
point. And yeah, and there was, I guess that we all kind of got a heart attack recently about the possible data localization law that was proposed in terms of, what was the status of that? Do you think that's likely to pass?
Well, anything can happen. Although we don't expect it to pass, because this matter was subject of discussions very recently in the context of a cybersecurity law for banks, for the bank system in Brazil. And this did not pass, and the central bank was very convinced that this was not the best practice for Brazil, considering our IT infrastructure and the costs of that and our need to attract more and more foreign investment. So we don't expect that to pass, although, as I said, anything can happen.
Yeah, and we have a question about the data transfers in terms of, do you think that is there anything like standard contractual clauses that have been proposed, or like you think that's something that Brazil will adopt?
Sorry, Amanda, I couldn't hear the last two.
Yeah, is there been any kind of discussion about whether Brazil will have its own form of model clauses or standard contractual clauses similar to what the EU and Argentina have done? Like, would you think that that's going to be a data transfer mechanism at some point?
Yeah, we expect that our models will be very similar to those in Europe. And in fact, that's what we have been proposing to clients. So although we think we will have a model, we don't expect it to be very different from those of Europe.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And is there a data breach reporting requirements under the law as well? And is there any kind of timing?
Yes, there is. But again, it depends on the national authority. That's not in place yet.
Gotcha. Okay, so lots to be determined by the national authority.
A lot. There are a lot of things to be determined by the authority. Well, I've got some of them here. For example, we need to get like the appropriate level of protection, what kind of standards will be set for that. We need the list of countries, or at least understand the mechanism to get the approval on a case-by-case basis to transfer data to a certain country, whether it is considered appropriate or not. We have some reporting obligations that would be in place, especially those reporting on the appropriateness of data protection in certain specific cases relating to sensitive data in Brazil. There are provisions of the law saying that the authority may establish some parameters to exempt certain types of companies from the obligation of appointing a DPO. Right now, we can't enforce that because there's no definition on the criteria for those exemptions. Mm-hmm. Another thing that we have is, for example, the interpretation of some parts of the law, right? We don't have a lot of detailed regulations, for example, on the use of cookies. When we get to that, and as I said before, we have been trying to fill in the gaps with GDPR. But for example, on this specific point and in some others, we don't see that the details that the European regulations bring would actually be in line with the principles of law. There are only a few cases that this is possible, that this is true. But in others, it's like the European rules are too detailed, and I don't think this would apply in Brazil. So we're really in a cloudy scenario for some parts where we try to adapt because the law is enforced, but we just don't know how to.
Right. And legitimate interest is a European concept, right? That you don't really have background in, right? So
yeah, so it's like, what's legitimate interest? We're trying to use the European concept, but we don't know if that's the same concept that the national authority will use.
So we had also a question on the health information. Is there, so one, in terms of, you have an employer that is going to insist on employees having their, a negative COVID test before returning back to work, is that something that would be allowed under LGPD, or is that something that you need the regulator to give more guidance on? And generally, like, what, I wonder if there's, because under the just trickier with employee data under GDPR. I don't know if there's, similar issues with dealing with employee data under LGPD.
Yeah, the COVID testing and also this pandemic moment has created a lot of questions, not only related to LGPD, but it also involves matters of employment laws in Brazil, which are very strict. When we're dealing with the tests, our understanding and the recommendation we give to the clients is that we believe they are entitled to request the tests because they are doing that in order to protect the health of everybody else in the working environment. And also the employer is in a duty to do that. There's a lot of discussion in Brazil, for example, if an employee gets COVID, whether the employer would be held liable for that, because these may be even considered like a work-related disease if the employee is able to prove that, someone else was infected in the work environment or anything. So we do believe that the employer would be in a position to request this test, although of course it cannot expose the employee's results to others or anything like that.
And can the employer rely on consent from the employee in terms of doing that testing, or either doing the testing or transferring the data, for example?
I think it's not even consent. It would be really one of the cases in which you can do that, which is to protect the health of people in general and safety of them. Mm-hmm. So that would be another basis, not really consent, because what you would do then if the employee just decides to deny consent for that. Mm-hmm. You'd position that either you tell them not to go to work, which wouldn't be fair to the others that consented, or let them go to work without taking the test, which is not safe to the others. So we wouldn't rely on consent for that. It would be really, protecting the health and safety of others.
And apart from COVID testing, just general employee data, like can employees consent to the transfer? Say if you have a US-based company with employee data in Brazil, can the employees consent to the transfer of the data outside of Brazil?
Yes, that would be, we would generally advise this to be in the privacy policy of the company, and then make sure that the employees is aware and acknowledges and agrees to that at the moment they are admitted to the company.
Great, good to know. So should we move on to data subject rights? It's interesting from the polling question, we've got, in terms of, we asked if the company is prepared for consumers exercising their rights under LGPD. We've got 76% have not done so yet, and 24% have. So I would imagine that a lot of what was done for GDPR for organizations will be useful, but what are the rights that the data subjects have under this law?
Yeah, well, there are mostly rights about being informed of what kind of data is stored by companies. They have the right to access that data. They have a right to request even elimination of that data if they have been processed in breach of the law. They may allow you to transfer it to another company. They may ask you to delete any data that has been processed solely based on consent, among other rights, and they can withdraw the consent that they have given at any time. So of course, if you are withholding that data based on other grounds other than consent, they will not be able to ask you to delete the information, because then you would simply say that, sorry, I'm not processing your data based on your consent. I'm processing your data based on, for example, legitimate interest. But then you would need to have this information organized, even to deny the request by the consumer, to the extent you have basis for that. And in fact, we have talked to some companies about how this has been going on, as the law has been effective for less than a month now. And really, I don't think Brazilians have noted the kind of power that this law has been given to them. We talked, for example, I was in an event earlier this week, and the General Counsel of Magalu, which is a very huge e-commerce company and retailer in Brazil. And they basically said that in 2 weeks' time, they only got 135 requests by consumers, which given their size is like nothing. And they were basically asking, you know, what kind of information do you have on me, and how do you process data within your company? And another thing that has been noted was that many of those requests were made by lawyers on their own behalf, not representing anyone. So we do have a feeling that they are actually testing the waters to see how things will go, or maybe getting some ideas to apply to their own clients. So let's see.
Yeah, we've seen that in California. We have a lot of class action attorneys that are feeling out, how companies and researchers, how companies are responding, to the requests. So, and I believe class actions are allowed under LGPD, right? And you've got civil actions already. So maybe, yeah, but has there been any kind of really, I guess, public education about the rights, that they have these rights under LGBT, or is that probably something that the regulator will have to do?
Well, in Brazil, when we're talking about class action, there are only a few people that can actually file class action in Brazil. One of them, and the one that does that more often, is the public prosecutor's office. There is now one lawsuit that has been filed, I guess 2 weeks ago, but the public prosecutor's office of Distrito Federal against a company that has been selling personal data on the internet. It's still in the early stages. We only had access to the plaintiff's petition. Let's see how it goes.
Bruce, what is for Coca-Cola? Have you done? What have you done to prepare for data subjects exercising their rights in Brazil? And was it based on what you did for GDPR or something different?
It was actually based on building off of what we did for California and the US. So we built a privacy portal in the US, and we basically just mirrored it for Brazil. And so we have a portal that takes people to our privacy policy as well as where they can exercise their rights. And that's where people have been exercising their rights. We haven't received as many as Bernadette's client in the month and a half, but we have received a good number, a decent number, which, on the back end, you've got to be able to fulfill those. So the important thing is you have to know where the data is so that when somebody makes a request, you can look for it and respond in the time frame required by LGPD. So you have to have a front end, but you also have to have a back end.
And that time frame is shorter than in some of the other laws, correct?
Yeah, it's 15 days.
Yeah, so you've got to know where the data is.
Yeah. And even like a silly question, right? Do you have any data on me? How do you answer that if you don't know where to look for?
Right, exactly. A lot of our clients too have seen those automated requests from mine and other kind of websites where it just seems to go through every email in your inbox and just blast out emails. So we've seen a lot of those kinds of automated requests that our clients get that isn't necessarily a customer. It's maybe somebody that received an email at some point, and so it can be challenging tracking down some of that information.
Or it can be even someone that you have interviewed. When we talked to an association of banks in Brazil, and they said that 1/3 of the requests they got so far refers to people that went to interviews with banks, and they wanted to know what kind of information, what kind of data the banks were storing on them.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So we mentioned, I guess, on the next slide, the regulator that is I guess authorized under law but still not formed. I guess what's the status, and what do you expect that regulator look like?
Yeah, what we have now, there's a law saying we will have a national authority. There's another law from August this year saying what kind of structure this authority will have, but no appointments have been made so far. So what we know based on the existing laws is that it's going to be a very small agency. There will be only 35 people working there, which for the size of Brazil is like nothing, especially when you're starting after the law has become effective. Another difficulty that we have been facing is that we thought about an agency at first that would be completely independent. Now, basically, what they're saying is that it will be technically independent, but there's no special budget for the agency. So it is under the budget of the Secretary of State, the Casa Civil. That's why we are expecting a lot of political interference in the agency, which is sad because this may even diminish our chances of being considered a country with appropriate level of protection under the European regulations, given that kind of influence that the agency may be subject to based on the structure. Another thing that we have been seeing is that although it has been said that the government is trying to put a lot of technical people in the agency to help, putting things in place and start running, since we're late on that, the kind of remuneration that has been established, the level of remuneration that has been established for the people, the 35 people that will work there, is not very attractive at all. It's kind of the type of remuneration that you would pay a junior associate in a law firm. So we're not sure what kind of professionals they will be able to attract with that kind of pay. But well, let's see how it goes. But these are the expectations. Let's see how it goes, and we expect to have it within the next few months because, as I said, we're late. We need help to implement the law.
Yeah, definitely. So Bruce, in terms of, there are so many uncertainties about this law and it's kind of rushed to effectiveness. What are the things that are keeping you up at night about this law?
Well, I think probably three things you could point to. The first one being the thing you emailed me about last week when you said, oh, did you know about this data localization law? And no, I hadn't heard about it, but luckily our folks in Brazil had, and they're working with industry groups and whatnot to fight it. And based on what Bernadette said, there may not be a great chance of it passing. So I'm optimistic about that. So maybe I can sleep a little on that. The second thing is probably litigation, and we've already seen some suits brought by consumer agencies, and I know that I've learned that Brazil is a litigious culture. So we're trying to make sure that our public-facing mechanisms are up to snuff, so that if somebody tests us, which it looks like they have, as well as they've tested Bernadette's client, we don't look bad. And then I think the third thing, and this is probably the biggest unknown for me, is what is the ANPD going to do? Are they going to generally follow, guidance that has been put out by the European regulators and mirror that? Are they going to do something completely different? Are they going to, have some wacky cross-border data transfer mechanism that's going to cause us to undertake a lot of effort in order to do it, because we do transfer a lot of data outside of Brazil? So that's the kind of thing that I'm most concerned, and I most closely watch what's coming out of the ANPD, or when it does come out.
Yeah, that's very, very wise concerns.
And talking about litigation, I think that's one other problem that may be increased by the fact that the agency is not operational yet, because we would expect that a lot of claims would be directed to the agency once it is installed. And as the agency doesn't exist, people are just running straight to court.
Right. Exactly. So what are the penalties? I think with GDPR, that was such a motivator in terms of companies really paying attention to the law. What are the responsibilities and fines under LGPD?
Well, first there is, some joint liability between controller and processor for breach of the law. And that's because the law intends to protect the data subject. So the law didn't want to create a position where there would be finger pointing between controller and processor, and the data subject would be left with nothing. So the idea is that you may sue either one of them, and then they will, deal with their share of liability among them. It's not a data subject's problem, it's their problem, and they have to solve between themselves. Another thing is the penalties, but of course the penalties depend on the agency being active, but they may go up to 50 million reais per violation. Of course, the criteria that will be used to go, from 0 to 2% of the group's turnover in Brazil will be determined by the agency. And we don't have that criteria right now. But one other very severe penalty that can be imposed is just, determine the elimination of any personal data related to the breach.
Yeah, that could be very damaging to an organization for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, for those that, many are tuning in now, and a lot of haven't started their preparations yet. So what's important to focus on to prepare for the law if you're just starting?
Yeah, well, as I said, you're not alone. A lot of companies were actually really counting on the delay of the entry into force of the law. Unfortunately or fortunately, it didn't happen. So in some cases, what we're doing is that we are really changing the tire while the car is moving. And what we tell our clients, focus on any kind of cybersecurity, on determining whether you have any cybersecurity vulnerabilities on your operation. Appoint a DPO immediately. Try to answer data subject requests to the very extent possible. If you're not very exposed, you don't do a lot of B2C, you may be less exposed because the number of people you're dealing with is smaller, but it doesn't mean that you're 100% safe. You need to focus on reviewing your contracts, privacy and cookies policies immediately, and work on training. At least, you can show that you have been doing some work on that, although you're not ready. And while you do that, then we would work on data mapping to confirming that all the actions that you're taking are appropriate. As Amanda mentioned, right, there are some systems that help companies do that. So a lot of companies are actually investing on those IT platforms and tools and software that can actually help you in the mapping of data that you have and organizing them. So you can, for example, fill in the data subject requests whenever necessary. Those softwares used to be very expensive at the very beginning when the law was enacted. But now there have been a lot of options that are more accessible. So people are really considering, and they have been very useful in helping companies be at least in a reasonably good shape, although not 100% compliant right now.
That's interesting, because in our polling question, 91% of the audience that responded has not invested in new technology to adapt. So, but for LGBT specifically, so it's not. It's possible they could be using something they use for GDPR or CCPA, and then only 15% have appointed a DPO for Brazil. And in terms of what you're seeing for DPOs, are organizations, are they appointing attorneys? Are they using law firms for these services? Or are they just hiring, employees that have a, interest or knowledge of privacy? Or what are you seeing in terms of the DPOs there?
We have a little bit of everything. With respect to the software, some companies have delayed investment on that because they did not believe that they would have a lot of data subject requests at the very beginning. So they decided to do what they could internally without making any major investments, considering especially the pandemic scenario. But we do believe in the long term, it would be impossible for them not to have any tools to help them manage that. Regarding the DPO, in Brazil, there is one thing that is different from other places, is that there is no personal liability of the DPO for the role that the DPO is performing. So that makes it easier to find someone willing to be appointed for that position. The DPO can be someone from the company, can also be someone from outside the company that has been engaged as a services provider. What we see is that we see a little bit of everything. Some companies have been asking mostly lawyers to take that position. In fact, one of my partners is a DPO for some companies. Another thing that we see a lot is, given the fact that there is no personal liability, some companies have been appointing someone in-house for that. And it's usually someone from either IT, legal, HR, or compliance. These are the main areas that have been used as DPOs for companies. There are some discussions when you use someone in-house on whether you need to pay additional remuneration for this person for that. But that's a labor and employment discussion. It does not involve LGPD. LGPD wouldn't get into that detail. It's really a labor matter.
Gotcha. So Bruce, were there any elements of your GDPR program that were used for Brazil, or what was it kind of what was used for preparing for Brazil, and what did you find most challenging about preparing for the LGPD?
I'll take the last part first. So I would say the part that was challenging was culture, and I don't know if Bernadette would agree with me, but there isn't. I was told over and over again by our attorneys and others in Brazil that Brazil doesn't have a culture of privacy. So people, would tend to think, well, why is this a big deal? Why do we need to bother with it? Especially people within the business itself who, their day job is marketing, and this is just sort of a nuisance. Why do I have to answer these questions? Why are you invading my space so much? So I would say that was the biggest challenge. In terms of, did we leverage what we did for GDPR? Yes, but we more so leveraged what we did for US privacy compliance, because, as we did GDPR in 2018, we did US privacy compliance in 2019, and we built off of the lessons learned in GDPR. So we improved it for US privacy compliance, and we were able to, connect Brazil resources with US resources to explain what they did on data subject rights, and what was in the privacy policy and why we wrote it a certain way. There were some things, because LGPD is modeled on GDPR, there were some things where we did connect the Brazil team to the GDPR team, such as with respect to cookies and how we handle cookies and our cookie notice. And so we were able to, leverage those resources. And I would say, if there's a hallmark of the Brazil project, it was shamelessly plagiarizing for what was already done at Coke, and just adapting it to Brazil. We didn't really create anything new for the Brazil project, and I think we benefited from learnings the company already had.
That's great. And given that you have been working on Brazil for quite a bit of time, what would your advice be to those companies that are just starting now to prepare? What was kind of the most labor intensive or difficult part for you?
Yeah, I would agree with what Bernadette has highlighted on the slide. I think it's really the public facing things that are most important to get right away, because you're being watched. People are going to be testing you, so you should have a way to allow people to fulfill their rights and give them the information that they have the right to request. But I don't think you can do that without having the back-end system. So a data inventory is so important. And whether you do that manually through spreadsheets or whether you use a tool like OneTrust, it's really important to know what data you have, where it is, and who's receiving it. And in terms of training, we've done some basic training, some very high-level sort of information that we've provided everyone in Brazil, all the employees. And we are doing the more in-depth training probably not until the first quarter of next year.
Great. It's good to know, Bruce. So Bernadette, we had a question from the audience. Are you advising your clients to enter into what under GDPR, we call the data processing addendum, where it's between the controller and the processor. Is that something that's being put in place, or is that something that you're waiting for more guidance on?
Well, we do advise our clients to have very strong contracts with those companies and very detailed ones, especially because we have the joint liability issue on that. But we are still waiting on a lot of guidance from the agency, from some aspects of it with respect to, for example, the level of protection that is expected for the data that is being processed and things like that. But to the extent that we think is possible for what we know there now, we are advising clients to have, strong written documentation and agreements with, between processor and controller for this purpose.
So the limitation of liability and indemnities probably get very important in those discussions, I would imagine.
Yeah, and also recourse, right? The right of recourse to get indemnification, yes.
Right, definitely.
And just getting to what Bruce said, I do agree with you, Bruce. I think it's one of the challenges of implementing LGPD in Brazil is the fact that differently from the Europeans, we do not have this culture of protecting data, not even our own personal data. If you get nowadays to any commercial building in the city of São Paulo, for example, you probably pass through a person before entering the building where they will ask you for ID. They will take a copy of your ID. They will insert your information in their system. They will take your picture, and then they will allow you into the building. Maybe this will change. I have not seen any building in São Paulo ever explaining to a data subject what kind of use is being made or why that information is being collected from them. And I have never seen anybody question that either. So it's even lawyers, right? We get in buildings, it's just the way it's done. We just handle the document and we'll get in the building. Of course, there are safety issues involved. They're protecting the safety of the people in the building and everything else, but how long do they store that data? We don't know. Is it used for any other purpose? It's not informed. So Brazilians don't usually think about it. It's very different from the behavior that we used to see from Europeans even before the law came into force over there.
You also your equivalent of your social security number, you share all the time, right?
My daughter knows my social security number. She's 7 because she hears me say it so many times in every store I go.
It'd be interesting to see if that changes over time. So
yeah.
We move, I guess, to the last slide. I guess the upcoming challenges. Where do we, where are the areas that your clients are really struggling, and what do you view as kind of things that you want to see going forward?
We think the main challenges is really, how the national authority will work, what kind of guidelines they will issue, what kind of positions they'll take, based also on how the national authority will work. Will this be sufficient for us to get recognition by the European Commission as an adequate level of protection country? What are the standards and interpretations that will be set not only by the agency, but also by the courts when applying the law? And how companies will deal with the legacy that they have. There's software, there's everything. We're making a lot of adjustments going forward, but there's this legacy there that nobody wants to touch because it's too complicated, and who knows what's there and what kind of treatment you give to it, what purpose and for how long it's going to be kept. I think that's a very big challenge for any company.
Yeah, definitely. It's very hard to delete data for all of our clients. Very hard.
Yeah.
And in terms of, do you think that has there been any, I guess, early discussions with the European Union as to whether you'll achieve adequacy, or is that it's something that you're just working towards because, and basically basing it on GDPR was kind of the first step?
Well, one of the purposes of having LGPD was to improve trade with Europe. Right? So being considered a company with an adequate level of protection is something that is very important. The thing is, our government is not very diplomatic with the Europeans right now. So I don't think we would able to get a very good cut of a deal at this point. But no, things change. There's election every 4 years. Let's see how it works.
Yes, yes. So similar boats right now. So another question about was there basically, since the MPD is not formed, the regulator is not formed yet, are companies appointing DPOs even though they can't be registered with the regulator yet? Like, so what's going on with is there any kind of procedure, or you just appoint somebody as your DPO?
Yeah, you need to appoint a DPO, and you need to inform data subjects who that DPO is, and you need to inform the contact details of that DPO. There is no actually definition on any possible restrictions. For example, there's nothing in the law saying that the DPO must be in Brazil. So some companies ask, can I appoint someone from my US office or from my French office to be the DPO? Right now, the answer is yes. We don't know if the authority will restrict there in the future. The only restriction that, although it's not written in the law, but based on just general Brazilian principle, is that the data subject must be able to assess the DPO in Portuguese.
Gotcha. So if we have like a client that has somebody who's from Brazil but not a lawyer, but is fluent in Portuguese, and in the U.S., it's possible that she could still serve as a DPO, but hopefully give her some little education on Brazilian privacy laws. But there's no requirement for them to be in Brazil or a lawyer, right? So
yeah, right now, no. At first, the law did say that the DPO had to be an individual with legal knowledge, but this was vetoed by the president at the time the law passed. So there's no such requirement, but nothing prevents the national authority from adding those requirements. So let's see how it goes. We don't expect them to restrict it to lawyers, because many times, you have people from other areas of knowledge that would be plenty capable of performing the activities of a DPO. But whether this person should be in Brazil or not, it's something that the agency may require that this person is in Brazil, mainly because not only this person must be accessible to data subjects, but it's also an intermediary, right, between the company and the agency. So it would be a better reach for the agency if the person is in Brazil.
And you just notify data subjects by posting on a privacy policy or on a website? Is that how?
Yes.
Okay, great. But we were about out of time. I don't know if there were any other questions from the audience. I really so appreciative of Bernadette and Bruce and providing their knowledge, expertise on this topic. I really appreciate you doing this, and appreciate all the great questions we got during the seminar. If there's, I guess, any other questions, you can put them in the chat box. Otherwise, I think, let's see any other questions. I think in terms of hopefully the bar, if you have additional questions, you can reach out to the bar, and they can put you in touch with any of us to handle other questions. But Bruce, if you had anything else to add before we chime off.
No, just appreciate everybody, coming and listening to us.
And there's a request for the slides to be made available. So I think, Bernadette, is it possible? I don't know if people can see. I think it's just your website. But yeah, if the bar, you can email us if you want to email. And we can get you a copy of the slides.
Yep.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for being a great audience, asking some really great questions, and thank you, Bernadette and Bruce.
Thank you.
We enjoyed the rest
Thank
of it.
you.
Okay, talk to you later.